Samuel chapter 11, and it's a pretty short chapter, and it sets the tone for what we're looking at tonight. So I'm going to read the entirety of 1 Samuel chapter 11. Now Nahash the Ammonite came up and besieged Jabesh-Gilead, and all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, "Make a covenant with us, and we will serve you." But Nahash the Ammonite said to them, "I will make it with you on this condition, that I will gouge out the right eye of every one of you. Thus I will make it a reproach on all Israel." The elders of Jabesh said to him, "Let us alone for 7 days, that we may send messengers throughout the territory of Israel. Then if there is no one to deliver us, we will come out to you." Then the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and spoke these words in the hearing of the people, and all the people lifted up their voices and wept. Now behold, Saul was coming from the field behind the oxen, and he said, "What is the matter with the people that they weep?" So they related to him the words of the men of Jabesh. Then the Spirit of God came upon Saul mightily when he heard these words, and he became very angry. He took a yoke of oxen and cut them in pieces, and sent them throughout the territory of Israel by the hand of messengers, saying, "Whoever does not come out after Saul and after Samuel, so shall it be done to his oxen." Then the dread of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out as one man. He numbered them in Bezek, and the sons of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah 30,000. They said to the messengers who had come, "Thus you shall say to the men of Jabesh-Gilead, tomorrow, by the time the sun is hot, you will have deliverance." So the messengers went and told the men of Jabesh, and they were glad. Then the men of Jabesh said, "Tomorrow we will come out to you, and you may do to us whatever seems good to you." The next morning Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the camp at the morning watch and struck down the Ammonites until the heat of the day. Those who survived were scattered, so that no 2 of them were left together. Then the people said to Samuel, "Who is he that said, 'Shall Saul reign over us?' Bring the men that we may put them to death." But Saul said, "Not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished deliverance in Israel." Then Samuel said to the people, "Come and let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there." So all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. There they also offered sacrifices of peace offerings before the Lord, and there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. So, here is the period of time before David, and of course this study is leading up to the life of David, but we're still kind of getting our feet wet in the material at the beginning of 1 Samuel. And so here is a strange and disturbing story, but a true one. This did actually happen. Question number 1, what nation or tribe was Nahash from? The Ammonites. So they occupied the territory that today is in the kingdom of Jordan. So across the Jordan River to the east of Israel is the territory of Ammon, and that's where this guy Nahash is from. What cruel demand did he place on the besieged town of Jabesh-Gilead? Isn't that horrible? That's just terrible. And they're asking him, they're begging him for mercy, saying, "If you don't kill us, we'll be your servants." And he says, "Okay, it sounds good to me, but you guys are such wimps, and you are so pathetic that I will accept your servitude on one condition, and that is if you let me gouge out the right eye of every man." Terrible, just absolutely horrific, very cruel, but it shows you the character of the king, shows you what he's like. And so what does this show about how he perceived the fighting spirit and capability of the Jews? Very, very low. They're not going to put up any kind of a fight at all. If they will submit to this, they deserve to be slaves, essentially, is what he's thinking. So, number 2, what was Saul doing when he heard about the situation at Jabesh-Gilead? Working in the field, he'd been plowing with the oxen. So there's a team of oxen, and he'd been plowing the fields, and that's when he is coming back into the village, and he realizes that everybody's weeping. So how did he respond to this news that came out of Jabesh-Gilead? He got so angry. He got very, very angry. Incidentally, Is anger always a sin? No, it's not. To be angry at the right thing, in fact, we're told, be angry and sin not. So there is a time and a place to be angry. We should be angry at sin. Being angry at one another, that just messes everything up. When we get mad at people, that's when we're in serious trouble. So Saul, he gets very angry, and he summoned the people, and he did so in a pretty dramatic fashion. How did he do it again? He cut up the cows that he'd been plowing with, apparently, just on the spur of the moment. I guess he got out his axe or his sword or something, and then he hands these chunks of meat and says, take this to the tribe, take this to the Ephraimites, take this to the Gadites, and tell them, if you don't show up tomorrow, this is what's going to happen to your cows. So can you imagine, the messenger shows up and says, who's the boss, who's the mayor? Well, that guy, and he plunks down a 5-pound chunk of raw cow and says, this is what's going to happen to your cow unless you show up ready to fight. Well, this kind of galvanized the Israelites, and how did they respond? Yeah, they came out, it says, as one man. So they were unified. And this is really a kind of a turning point, because if you think back into the book of Judges, what was Israel like during that entire 300 to 325 year period of time? They couldn't get along for nothing. They were very tribal. There was actually periods of civil war where they were fighting against each other, and they saw themselves as 12 distinct tribes. In this case, one man, Saul, says, show up, and they all come out. So this is a turning point in the history of Israel. Number 3, how many Israelites were in the fight against the Ammonites? 330,000. That's a fair-sized army. That's a significant army. And who won? The Israelites did. And again, if you think back into what's going on before this time, think back through the book of Judges, 300 years, and the Philistines and the Ammonites and the Midianites and all these different ites are chasing Israel around back and forth and up and down. And so this is revolutionary, that the Israelites can mobilize a large army, fight a battle, and win. And so this is new. What do the Israelites want to do with the Israeli men who had insulted Saul previously? So remember before, when Samuel had announced, here's your king, look, he's head and shoulders taller than everybody else. Look, he's handsome, and he is the king that has been selected. And some of the men said, him? He's going to be our king? Yeah, right. So they were very, very insulting. And now, after this battle, after they have seen Saul take the leadership role, after the entire nation has seen Saul step forward and say, we're going to fight, because we're not going to let one of our towns become enslaved to the Ammonites. We're not going to do that. We're going to fight, and we're going to win. And so now everybody says, he's a real king. Who were those guys again that were insulting him? And what did they want to do with him? They wanted to execute him, kill him on the spot. You insulted the king. Now, how did Saul respond in verse 13 of chapter 11? Nobody's going to get killed today. And notice what he said. The reason for that is, for today the Lord has accomplished deliverance in Israel. What do you think of Saul right there? Humble, godly, got a good head on his shoulders. He's showing some wisdom and some discernment. The guy's a class act right here, isn't he? He's on top of things. You would say about him, well, okay then. He says, God has blessed us with a victory. Today is not the day for killing our own countrymen. That is not a good idea. We are going to trust God and God is going to bless us. And so he's off to a good start. He doesn't say about himself, look at me, I'm a great battle leader, I'm an incredible general, I'm a brilliant tactician and strategist, and it's a good thing you got me as king. He didn't say that. He said, the Lord has given us salvation today. So right here, Saul is a pretty good guy. And we would say about him, we're impressed. So what does this show about his character? We've already kind of summarized. He's not vindictive. He honored God. He's trusting the Lord. He shows wisdom and maturity rather than being vengeful towards people who had insulted him. He says, no, nobody's dying today. We're not going to do that. Now, question number 4. Chapter 12 is the record of the meeting at Gilgal to renew the kingdom in a covenant before God. Samuel rehearses the events of the exodus from Egypt, the years of the judges, and God's gracious faithfulness up to the present day. Does Samuel say that the Israelites' desire for a king was a good thing or a bad thing? He's very clear. He says, this is a bad idea. You have rejected God. And in your motivation to be like the other nations and to have a king, this is not a good move at all. And why does he say that? I kind of just answered it. Yeah, God. They're rejecting God as their ruler. So what is the significance of the wheat harvest that he mentions in verse 17? We're in chapter 12 now. Exactly. So the wheat harvest is the dry season, and you just don't get thunder and rain in the dry season. That doesn't happen. You know, it'd be like August in Mount Washington Valley and calling for a snowstorm. Well, that just doesn't happen. You know, that's extremely unusual. And so it is a legitimate miracle. It is a sign from God. And the miracle that Samuel asks for is thunder and rain. And what was it for? What was the purpose or the point of this miracle? To cause people to fear the Lord and to certify that what Samuel had just said is the truth. To certify that Samuel had just been speaking God's truth to the people. Number 5, what sort of encouragement and challenge does Samuel close with in 12:20 through 25? So the people, upon recognizing what Samuel had been saying and certified by the miraculous thunder and rain, they begin weeping. And they're mourning and moaning and groaning. So, we've made a terrible mistake. This is awful. And they beg Samuel, please don't stop praying for us. And they're suggesting, they're implying, do you think God is going to abandon us because we've been so wicked? And so Samuel closes with this word, the Lord will not abandon you, but you have a responsibility, and that responsibility is fear the Lord and serve him. So down in verse 20 is where he says this, do not fear, you have committed all this evil, yet do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. You must not turn aside, for then you would go after futile things, which cannot profit or deliver, because they are futile. For the Lord will not abandon his people on account of his great name, because the Lord has been pleased to make you a people for himself. And then he goes on to say, I'm going to keep on praying. I'm going to continue to intercede for you. And so Samuel encourages the people. Number 6, how old was Saul when he became king? 40 years old. And I don't remember what verse that's in. Oh, no, you're right, 30. It says 30 right there. I wrote down the wrong number. Sorry, Mike. And how long did he rule? I'll see. Mine says he was 40 years old and they ruled 32 years. So I conflated them, I think. How many men formed his personal guard or standing army? Yes. And he kept 2,000 with him, and 1,000 were assigned to his son Jonathan. So these would be, in the ancient world, remember that it was quite unusual to have what we would call a professional or a standing army. there simply wasn't enough income, money, food to provide for, an army of 100,000. It mostly operated like a militia. So all able-bodied men were expected to fight when called upon by the king. And they might have training, they might get together on an occasional basis to train for war, but they were farmers, and they were potters and carpenters and smiths and so on. They had families, and they lived with their families. But here, when it says that Saul had 3,000 men, that means that they are his standing army. And likely, when the militia is called together, so when there's a crisis, and we're getting attacked, and he mobilizes the entire nation, that standing army is going to function like the general staff. So they're going to be the generals and the colonels and the majors who would take leadership of the guys who walk in off the farms. These 3,000 men are Saul's professional army. Number 7, who started the conflict with the Philistines? Saul, and specifically Jonathan, his son. So he is the one at this place called Michmash who climbed up. How many warriors did the Philistines have, and how many chariots? 30,000. Now this is a wild number, but that's what it says. 30,000 chariots. Imagine if we heard that China had 30,000 fighter jets, or Russia had 30,000 tanks. That's the effect. A chariot was a major weapon in the ancient world. It showed how strong you were. By the way, these chariots would have been pulled by either 2 or 4 horses, and then they would have had additional horses in reserve. And every chariot had at least 2 men on it, sometimes 3, and then you had a staff to take care of the chariot, repair the chariot, feed the horses, care for the horses. This is a huge army. This is gigantic. 6,000 horsemen, as well as the 30,000 chariots. Question number 8, how did Israel respond to this imminent threat? Caves, thickets, cliffs, cellars, pits, cisterns, any place they could find to get underground or get out of sight. So this is reminiscent of the bad old days during the Judges, when they had no military ability and they would just hide. And that's what they're doing now. They're running and hiding, looking for holes in the ground. Apparently, Samuel had told Saul to wait for him to come for how long? 7 days. Wait 7 days and I will be there. And what action did Saul take when he thought Samuel was not going to arrive in time? He offered a sacrifice, and that wasn't his job. He's intruding into a different office now, and that is a bad thing. It shows impatience, it shows a lack of trust. His response, of course, is, I had to do it because the people are beginning to wander off. My army is deserting me because we needed to have God's blessing. So number 9, when did Samuel arrive? On the 7th day, immediately after offering the sacrifice. Bad timing. And what was the first thing that Samuel said to Saul? What have you done? Yeah, words that nobody likes to hear. Yeah, that's right. When it came down from the mountain, yeah. And I think it's probably been used by a few parents on their kids too. Yeah. What have you done? Yeah, yeah. You can hear that, can't you? What did he tell Saul would be the consequences of his action? You're going to lose the kingdom. Wow. Doesn't that seem a little over the top? Doesn't that seem a little harsh? You're forfeiting the kingdom. You're forfeiting. If you had obeyed, God would have made you a dynasty, and your children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren would have been on the throne. But as it stands, he's going to take the kingdom and give it to somebody else. Doesn't that seem harsh? God's word is not harsh. It's what it is. And what is going on here is Saul, although he started great just a chapter ago, is now showing signs that he's not obedient. He doesn't follow God's rules. And that is a major flaw. Why is this punishment so severe? It shows a lack of obedience to God. Number 10, who did Samuel tell Saul that God had appointed? Yeah, a man after his own heart, and we know that that's going to be David. Now, just pause here. This will show up a lot later on in our studies on David. But ponder for a moment. You know these stories. You've read them all your lives. Did David sin any less spectacularly than Saul? No. David committed adultery. David committed murder. David counted the army. Wasn't supposed. David had trouble with pride. David, he sins, and he sins grievously. So how can Samuel say here, God is picking a man that's after his own heart instead of you? Yes. The secret, the big difference between David and Saul is when God confronted Saul, Saul had excuses. It's the people, or you were running late, or we saved the best for you, or when God, through his prophet, confronted David, David said, I have sinned against the Lord. And that's the big difference. That's the thing that makes David a man after God's own heart, and Saul just never quite gets with the program. Number 11, what sort of a monopoly did the Philistines have in 1319? So, iron and steel technology. The Philistines were great metallurgists. They had learned the secret, and they kept it a secret, of how to take raw pig iron and turn it into carburized steel. And the implication of that statement in this chapter is that the Jews did not have access to high-quality weapons, and even what they had was probably largely farm implements. They're probably going out to war with hoes and rakes and shovels, and a lot of what they had, a lot of what the Jews had by way of metal implements, would have been made not out of steel or iron, but out of, can you guess? Bronze. Bronze. So we're in the Bronze Age. We're at the end of the Bronze Age in the Middle East. And bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. And it can be, it is a very useful metal, but it's not generally thought of as holding an edge, like for swords or spears. And it's not going up against steel, it's very inferior. So the Philistines have a technological advantage over the Jews. And the means, the way that is the case is because their weapons are better and more numerous. Number 12, where did Jonathan and his armor bearer decide to test the strength of the Philistine army? At their garrison in the pass of Michmash. So it's on a steep ridge, and there's a declivity, kind of a gorge, and you can look up to the top and see. But in order to get up there, you're going to have to, well, that's one of the questions, climb up on hands and feet. You can't just walk up it, you have to climb. He decides, we're going to test the strength of the Philistine garrison there. And what sort of an attitude did Jonathan have in 14:6? Yeah, very interesting. He says, come, let us cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. Perhaps the Lord will work for us. For the Lord is not restrained to save by many or by few. And Jonathan's a sharp guy. He understands the truth. God doesn't need a big army to accomplish his plans. He can do whatever he wants with a few people or with a lot of people. So there's just two of them. Was his armor bearer on his side, was he supportive? He says, yep, anything you want, I'm right here, I got your back. So number 13, why would Jonathan have to climb up? Because it's so steep. How many Philistines did Jonathan and his armor bearer kill? About 20. And then what happened to the garrison in Michmash? So they see what is happening, and they realize one Jew can take out 20 of us. And it is so out of their experience, because you realize in the context here, all the surrounding nations look at the Jews as easy pickings. They're not strong, they run, they hide, they don't have weapons, they're easy to kill, and if you put them on the run, they'll just keep on running. They're easy pickings. And so when one Jewish man kills 20 of them in one encounter, the garrison, and we were not told how many it is, but the garrison says, we've never seen anything like this. This is not supposed to be happening. And they take off running, and then there's a camp down in the valley, and the guys are running down out of the hills saying the Jews are coming. And then word spreads, and it's a panic. And the entire Philistine army just begins running. And there's so many Philistines running that it's like making the ground tremble. And so the garrison runs away. Now, sadly, we're beginning to see flaws in Saul. So we've already seen he offered a burnt sacrifice when he wasn't supposed to. That was disobedient. He was supposed to wait for Samuel. And he's not waiting on God. And now he does something else that's really foolish. What did he say? He made a vow. He says, nobody in the army is allowed to eat anything until we have complete victory, or I will kill him. And that was really foolish, because running, chasing, fighting is high calorie output. And he's not taking into account, if you're chasing enemies and trying to keep from being killed and you're trying to kill them, you really ought to have enough calories to run your muscles. And so you remember the rest of the story. Jonathan, who had not heard about Saul's vow, went into a forest where evidently there were a lot of bee trees, and honey is actually dripping out of the trees. And he's able to take some on a stick and eat it, and he says, oh, that's so good. And it's carbohydrates. He's got energy. And now he can continue. And then later on, we see another effect of it with the army as a whole. What was that? Did you catch that? The army as a whole, they were so ravenously hungry at the end of the day that they were taking the animals, the Philistines' pack animals, killing them and kind of eating them raw, which Jews are not supposed to do. You're not supposed to eat the meat with the blood. And they were, but it was Saul who caused this problem. And he's just not wise. He doesn't have discernment. And so Saul's vow, and then, at the very end of it, they cast lots because somebody wasn't there. How did this happen? And the lot finds Saul's son Jonathan. And Jonathan says, well, Dad, I found honey and I ate it. And look, my eyes are bright. You said something stupid. And Saul says, you've got to die. Do you remember what happened next? The people said, you're not killing your son today. It was by his hand that this great victory came to us. Jonathan started this battle, and God has blessed us with victory. You're not killing your son today. But we can begin to see Saul has issues. Yeah, he's beginning to goes sideways now. And sadly, it's not going to get better. It's going to be kind of downhill from here. Do you have any other questions or comments on what we looked at tonight? So take your prayer bulletins, please.